If you sleep in that tin coffin, Arthur, the frost won't just kill you. It'll freeze your eyes shut before you can even scream for help. Those were the exact words Gideon Cole spat onto the frozen dirt of the trading post lot, his breath billowing like white smoke in the bitter, late October chill. It was the autumn of 1,954 inches, the isolated foothills of northern Idaho, right where the shadow of the Bitterroot Range begins to stretch across the valley. People in these parts knew that winter didn't just visit. It settled in like an invading army. Everyone was busy preparing, their axes swinging from dawn to dusk, stacking pine and larch as high as their cabin eaves. But Arthur Thorne was doing something that made the local woodsmen stop their wagons and stare in sheer bewilderment. He had rolled into the valley with a flatbed truck carrying 3 rusted, war-surplus military Quonset huts. They were battered half-cylinders of corrugated steel, 35 feet long and 16 feet wide, salvaged from a decommissioned Army supply depot over in Washington. They looked ugly, covered in patches of orange rust along the bottom flanges, with the interior panels rattling like loose sheet metal every time the truck hit a rut in the dirt road. Gideon Cole, the most respected carpenter in the territory, stood with his arms crossed over his heavy wool coat. He had built nearly every log cabin in the From Valley, utilizing the same heavy spruce timbers and mud chinking that his father had used before him. To Gideon, building a winter home out of military surplus, sheet metal was an insult to the craft of homesteading. He spat his tobacco juice near the flatbed's tires, shaking his head. He knew that the valley did not forgive mistakes, and to him, Arthur's steel structures were the greatest mistake a man could make. He turned to the crowd of onlookers, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet clearing, declaring that the metal would act as a massive heat drain, drawing every ounce of warmth from the interior, leaving the occupant to freeze, long before the spring thaw arrived. Arthur Thorne didn't bother to look up. He was 45, a quiet man who spoke only when the silence could no longer do the job. He had spent the Second World War as a Navy shipwright in the Aleutian Islands, watching how wind and ice behaved on bare metal hulls. He knew that the local builders trusted their massive logs, but he had also seen those same builders burning through piles of firewood just to keep their living rooms barely livable, while their bedrooms frosted over. He quietly unhooked the tie-down straps, letting the first corrugated steel rib slide off the truck with a heavy, metallic clang that echoed across the valley. He had a different understanding of warmth, one based on the fluid movement of air rather than the sheer thickness of wood. If you want to discover more forgotten survival techniques like this one that kept families safe when the modern world failed, remember to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel right now. We read every comment, and your support helps us bring these stories to life. As the truck drove away, Arthur stood alone in the clearing. He had surveyed his, quotes, land carefully, choosing a flat stretch of dirt precisely 15 degrees off-center from the prevailing northwest winds. He knew the wind in these mountains didn't just blow, it scoured. It would find any flat wall and strip the heat away like sandpaper, but a curved surface, aligned just right, would force the wind to slide over it. Arthur picked up his shovel and began clearing the dirt for a single, unbroken concrete pad, stretching a full 5 feet from one end to the other. By mid-November, the continuous concrete pad had fully cured, sitting like a long gray ribbon across Arthur's clearing. It was a massive piece of work, one unbroken slab that didn't have the typical crawl spaces of the local log cabins. Gideon Cole had ridden past on his horse twice that week, watching Arthur work, with a mixture of amusement and irritation. He'd seen people try clever tricks before, but bolting 3 military barracks together like train cars was a step too far into madness. Arthur worked with a methodical, step-by-step precision. He erected the curved steel ribs one by one, anchoring them directly into the concrete pad. He bolted the 3 Quonsets end to end, sealing the connecting rings with a thick, rubberized compound and heavy lag bolts spaced every 4 inches. The structure began to take shape, looking less like a home and more like a giant metal caterpillar resting in the Idaho clearing. But the real mystery lay inside. Arthur didn't leave the interior as one long, drafty tunnel. He built 2 thick, wooden bulkhead walls, dividing the 105 feet into 3 distinct 35-foot chambers. In each bulkhead, he carefully framed specific openings. Near the concrete floor, he cut 2 rectangular vents, 12 inches high and 20 inches wide. At the very top of each arch, right against the curved ceiling, he positioned a larger framed opening, 28 inches wide and 16 inches high. Thomas Finch, a hired hand from the next farm over, came by to deliver a load of feed and stood inside the second chamber, looking at the bulkheads with his lantern held high. He pointed his finger at the rectangular openings near the rectangular openings floor. He wanted to know why Arthur was cutting holes in walls that were supposed to keep the cold out. To Thomas and to the rest of the valley, a wall was meant to be solid, an absolute barrier against the elements. Cutting holes in it seemed like inviting the enemy directly inside. Arthur explained that the openings were not drafts, but control valves for the moving air. But Thomas didn't understand. He went back to the trading post that evening and told everyone that Arthur Thorne was cutting holes in his walls to let the winter wind whistle through his home. The laughter at the trading post grew louder. They imagined Arthur sitting in his metal tube, freezing as the mountain drafts blew through his carefully framed holes. They didn't understand that Arthur wasn't building 3 separate rooms. He was building a single, self-regulating thermal loop. He placed his cast-iron potbelly stove in Unit 1, the northernmost chamber that faced the teeth of the northwest wind. But instead of centering the stove in the middle of the arch, Arthur placed it 18 inches closer to the western wall. When Gideon heard about the off-center stove, he laughed openly during the Sunday social at the church. He told the circle of ranchers that Arthur didn't even know how to set a stove straight, predicting that the western wall would glow red while the eastern side remained freezing. Arthur let them talk. He went back to his clearing, carrying split timber into the first chamber, stacking his couy under the curve of the steel arches where it would stay dry and protected from the autumn rain. He knew that the cold was coming, and he knew that when it arrived, the arguments of the traditional builders wouldn't matter anymore. Only the physics of the draft would tell the truth. The first real test came in the 3rd week of November. A sudden cold front swept down from the peaks, dropping the temperature to a crisp 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Arthur woke to find the ground frozen hard as granite. He walked into Unit 1, his breath rising in thick plumes in the unheated space, and built his first fire in the cast-iron potbelly stove. He used dry pine, kindling, letting the flames catch before adding 2 split logs of cottonwood. At first, the experiment was a complete failure. Instead of traveling down the length of the structure, the smoke stalled in the fromly apex of Unit 1, filling the room with a gray, choking haze. The air pressure didn't equalize, and the cold air from Unit 2 and Unit 3 began rushing back through the high vents, creating a reverse draft that pushed the smoke out of the stove's firebox door. Arthur stood in the middle of the room, coughing, his eyes stinging from the soot, while his wife Margaret watched from the airlock entry with a wet cloth held over her nose. She warned him that the smoke was trapped and that the air was too cold to move. Arthur didn't panic. He opened the doors to let the smoke clear, then sat down on a wooden crate with his notebook, studying the draft. He realized he had made a fundamental error in his calculations. The high vents in the bulkhead walls were too large, allowing the cold air from the unheated chambers to rush back before the warm air could establish a dominant forward pressure. He spent the warm air could establish. Next 12 hours, working with his handsaw and drill, he fabricated adjustable, wooden sliding panels for the low-floor vents, allowing him to control the fanned intake of cool air. He then reduced the size of the high vents by half, covering them with thin plywood panels that he could adjust with simple pegs. He relit the fire, but this time he carefully managed the sliding panels. He closed the low vents in Unit 2 completely, forcing the stove to draw its air from the small intake vent he'd cut in the outer door of Unit 1. He let the fire burn hot, heating the western wall where the stove was offset. As the western metal wall warmed, it began to heat the air adjacent to it. Because the stove was offset, this warm air rose along the curve of the western arch, creating a gentle, natural rotation. Instead of rising straight up and pooling in a stagnant mass at the ceiling, the air began to spin, creating a low-frequency vortex that pushed the cold air down the eastern wall and toward the floor. Arthur opened the high vent in the first bulkhead just 2 inches. He watched the smoke from a small splinter of pine he'd lit near the opening. The smoke didn't rise. It was sucked horizontally through the vent, moving cleanly into Unit 2. He walked into the middle chamber and held his hand near the high opening. A steady, gentle stream of warm air was flowing through, as soft as a summer draft. By midnight, the air loop was running perfectly. The low vents in Unit 2 were drawing the cool air back into Unit 1, creating a continuous, silent cycle that required no fans or mechanical assistance. Arthur walked the full 105 feet of his metal caterpillar, his footsteps echoing softly on the concrete. In Unit 1, the temperature read 63 degrees. In Unit 2, 30 feet from the stove, it was 48. Even in Unit 3, 70 feet from the fire, the thermometer showed 42. He turned to Margaret and told her that the air was carrying the heat all by itself, without a single draft to slow it down. The secret to Arthur Thorne's Quonset train lay in a principle that most of the traditional cabin builders had never encountered: the natural cascade of heat. In a standard rectangular log cabin, the air behaves in a chaotic, inefficient way. When a fire is lit, the hot air rises straight up to the flat ceiling, where it pools in a thick, stagnant layer. Because the ceiling is flat, the heat has no direction to travel. It sits there, slowly bleeding through the roof boards, while the floor remains cold enough to freeze water. But the curved arch of the Quonset hut changes this dynamic completely. The semicircular ceiling acts like a natural guide, channeling the rising warm air toward the apex. Instead of spreading out laterally and losing its energy against flat corners, the heat is focused into a concentrated ridge that runs along the very top of the arch. Arthur's bulkhead walls turned this concentrated ridge of heat into an engine of movement. By placing the high vents right at the apex of the bulkheads, he gave the warm air a pathway. Because warm air is less dense than cold air, naturally seeks out areas of lower temperature and pressure. The unheated space of Unit 2 acted as a thermal sink, drawing the warm air from Unit 1 through the high vent. At the same time, the low floor vents created a return loop. As the warm air entered Unit 2, it began to cool and sink toward the concrete floor. This cool, dense air was then drawn back into Unit 1 through the low vents, pulled by the low-pressure zone created by the stove's draft. It was a continuous, self-sustaining loop that operated without a single mechanical part. The heat didn't just sit in one room. It cascaded from one chamber to the next, like water flowing through connected pools at descending levels. Gideon Cole and the other builders believed that the steel walls would conduct the cold inward, and they were right about the properties of metal. Steel has a thermal conductivity hundreds of times greater than wood. If you touch a bare steel wall on a freezing winter morning, it will instantly draw the seeply heat from your fingers. But what Gideon didn't understand was that Arthur wasn't trying to heat the part of it. Steel. He was heating the air column inside, and he was keeping that air moving. Because the air was in constant, gentle motion, it didn't have time to transfer its heat to the cold metal skin. The moving air created a boundary layer, a quiet buffer zone that prevented the cold steel from robbing the room of its warmth. The traditional builders spent their winters fighting the cold with brute force, building larger and larger fires in their fireplaces, losing most of their heat up the chimney. Arthur was doing the opposite. He was using the natural laws of temperature and pressure to distribute his heat evenly, ensuring that every BTU of energy produced by his potbelly stove was utilized before it could escape into the Idaho night. To fully understand why the air traveled so cleanly through the 105 feet of Arthur's structure, you have to look at the small, seemingly casual, decision he made regarding the stove's placement. Gideon Cole had laughed when he saw the stove set 18 inches closer to the western wall, believing it was an error of planning. It was in fact the most critical detail of the entire system. In a symmetrical room with a centered stove, the warm air rises in a straight vertical column, hits the ceiling, and spreads out evenly in all directions. This creates a balanced, static condition where the air doesn't want to move laterally. The air becomes stagnant, and the heat stays trapped directly above the stove. But by placing the stove off-center, Arthur broke this symmetry. The air, adjacent to the western steel wall, warmed much faster than the air on the eastern side. Because warm air rises and cold air sinks, this temperature difference created a natural rotational bias. The warm air rose along the curve of the western arch, crossed the apex, and then descended along the cooler eastern wall. It was a gentle, rolling vortex that turned the entire air column in Unit 1 into a slow-spinning wheel. This rotation prevented the warm air from pooling statically at the ceiling. Instead of sitting above the stove, air was continuously pushed toward the high vent in the bulkhead wall, directed by the curve of the arch itself. The wind also played a role in Arthur's design, though not in the way his neighbors expected. Gideon's cabins were rectangular, with flat, vertical walls that took the full impact of the northwest gale. When a 40-mile-per-hour wind hits a flat wall, it creates a localized high-pressure zone on the windward side and a low-pressure zone on the leeward side. This pressure difference forces cold air through every tiny crack in the log chinking, creating drafts that strip the heat away instantly. But Arthur's Quonsets were rounded. The wind didn't hit a flat surface, it slid over the curved arches, deflecting the pressure. And because the long axis of the structure was aligned 15 degrees off-center from the prevailing wind, the wind pressure was never perpendicular to the end caps. The wind slid past the metal caterpillar, leaving the interior air column stable and undisturbed. There were no high-pressure pockets forcing drafts through the joints, no sudden gusts disrupting the delicate convective loop inside. The air moved smoothly through the bulkheads, guided by the internal valves, carrying the heat from the northern source to the southern sink without a single draft to slow it down. By mid-December, the winter had settled into the valley with a quiet, icy finality. The mountains were covered in a thick shroud of white, and the Popo, Aggie River was frozen solid from bank to bank. But inside Arthur's Quonset train, the concrete slab had become a silent ally in the fight against the cold. Concrete is often dismissed by traditional builders as a cold, damp material, and they are right when it is poured thin and left in direct contact with frozen ground. But concrete has a moderate thermal mass, with a volumetric heat capacity far greater than wood or packed earth. Arthur's continuous pad was 4 inches thick, 105 feet long, and 16 feet wide, representing tons of dense material. For the first 3 days of the cold snap, Arthur had kept the potbelly stove burning hot, letting the counterflow loop run continuously. During this period, the concrete slab slowly absorbed the ambient heat from the warm air circulating above it. Once the slab reached equilibrium temperature, it began to function as a massive thermal battery. It didn't generate heat, but it held it, releasing it slowly and evenly back into the air long after the fire in the stove had burned down. Margaret Thorne noticed the difference on the third night of the freeze. She woke at 3 in the morning to find the fire in Unit 1 had reduced to a bed of glowing coals. In their old cabin, such a drop in fire intensity would have meant waking to a freezing room with frost forming on the blankets. But inside the Quonset, the air remained warm. The thermometer on the bulkhead wall read 58 degrees, only 5 degrees cooler than it had been when they went to bed. The concrete floor beneath her feet was not ice cold. It was comfortable, radiating a gentle, steady warmth that kept the entire structure above the freezing point. She told Arthur that the floor was holding the heat, and that it felt like they were sleeping on a warm stone. Arthur explained that the mass took 3 days to charge, but now it was doing the work for them. Gideon Cole's cabin, by contrast, had no thermal battery. His floor was made of pine planks suspended over a cold crawlspace, and his log walls lost their heat as fast as the wind could scour them. Gideon was burning through his woodpile at a frantic pace, waking every 3 hours to feed his stove, and still waking to a cold house every morning. He didn't understand that Arthur had built a structured approach that didn't just heat the air, it heated the very structure itself, turning the concrete and the steel into a reservoir of warmth that the Idaho winter couldn't penetrate. The blizzard of January 1955 is still talked about by the old-timers in northern Nausen, Idaho, as the winter that nearly broke the valley. It started on the morning of January 5th. The sky had taken on a dark, leaden hue, and the wind, which had been blowing from the west, suddenly shifted to the northwest, bringing with it a cold so intense that the moisture in the air seemed to freeze into tiny, glittering needles. By noon, the thermometer at the trading post read 25 degrees below zero. The wind chill was estimated at 50 below. It was the kind of cold that turns diesel fuel to gel, makes the timber in cabin, walls groan and crack like pistol shots, and turns a man's breath into ice on his collar within seconds of stepping outside. At the farm of Jonas Miller, located 2 miles south of Arthur's homestead, situation was turning into a disaster. Jonas was 32, a hard-working rancher with 40 head of Hereford cattle and a young family. His barn, built with traditional vertical timbers, was taking the full force of the gale. The wind found every tiny gap in the boards, forcing fine, powdery snow inside, where it drifted over the cattle's bedding and froze their water troughs solid. Jonas spent his morning with a heavy iron bar, hacking at the ice in the frozen troughs, his hands numb, despite his heavy leather mittens. He could hear his brossai, cows coughing, a low, wet sound that made his stomach knot with worry. If the Prussians Trading 7 water stayed frozen, his animals wouldn't eat, and if they didn't eat, they would lose their body heat and freeze to death in their stalls. His woodpile, stacked under a canvas tarp on the north side of the barn, had been buried under a 4-foot drift. The snow had melted slightly during a brief thaw the week before, and now the entire pile was frozen into a solid, icy mass. Jonas had to use a splitting maul just to pry loose a few logs, his shoulders aching from the effort, his breath catching in his throat as the Arctic wind whipped around the corner of the building. He went inside to warm his hands, telling his wife Sarah that they were burning through their fuel too quickly. He had been forced to burn green, unseasoned pine logs that produced more smoke than heat, leaving the house sitting at barely 40 degrees. Sarah was wrapping their 3-year-old son in a heavy wool blanket, her own face pale with cold. She warned him that the chimney was backdrafting, forcing smoke into the kitchen and making their eyes burn. Jonas looked out the frosted window. He could see his neighbor's cabin, Gideon Cole's place, half buried in the drifts. Gideon's chimney was pouring thick, black smoke into the wind, a sign that he was firing his stove full blast, burning through his wood at a rate that no homestead could sustain for long. Jonas knew that if the storm lasted another 3 days, half the families in the valley would be out of dry wood, and their livestock would be dead in their stalls. He looked toward the right-ended Denate foothills, where Arthur Thorne's metal caterpillar sat silent and invisible in the driving snow. And he wondered if the quiet mechanic was still alive in his iron tube. Inside the first chamber of Arthur's Quonset train, the sound of the blizzard was a terrifying metallic roar. The 40-mile-per-hour wind hit the curved steel arches with the force of a physical blow, creating a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the concrete pad and into the very air of the room. It sounded like being inside a giant drum during a thunderstorm, a constant wind-driven rattle that made the tin panels hum and shake. But as you stepped through the bulkhead door into Unit 2, the sound changed. The thick wooden bulkhead and the 12-inch air gap between the inner and outer metal skins acted as an acoustic barrier. The metallic roar of the wind became a distant, muffled hum, like the sound of surf on a far-off shore. And in the center of the middle chamber, the only sound was the deep, rhythmic drafting of the warm air as it moved through the bulkhead vents. It was a strange, peaceful contrast. Outside, the Idaho winter was raging with a lethal force, trying to rip the roof off every building in the valley. But inside the Quonset, the air was warm and still. The convective loop was running with a steady, quiet efficiency, carrying the heat from the stove in Unit 1 through all 3 chambers. Margaret Thorne sat at the kitchen table in Unit 1, her work clothes comfortable, her hands warm as she mended a wool sock. Her daughters, Ruth and Clara, were playing with wooden blocks on the concrete floor, their laughter quiet in the cozy space. The thermometer on the western wall read 64 degrees. Arthur stood near the bulkhead door, his hand resting on the wooden sliding panel of the low vent. He could feel the gentle, steady pull of the air as it was drawn back into the first chamber, a cool, quiet current that moved along the floor at barely 2 miles per hour. Margaret looked up, commenting on how hard the wind was pushing against the metal panels. Arthur smiled, noting that the wind could only push against a curve, unable to find a single corner to grab. The sensory experience inside the Quonset was completely different from any traditional cabin. There was no smell of acrid smoke or creosote, because the dry cottonwood Arthur burned in his potbelly stove consumed itself cleanly, leaving no soot in the flue. The air didn't feel damp or heavy. The gentle, constant movement of the convective loop prevented moisture from stagnating, carrying the water vapor from their breath and cooking through the ridge vents before it could condense on the cold steel walls. They were living in a microclimate of their own design, a safe, warm pocket of air protected by 80 feet of steel and concrete. While their neighbors were fighting the storm with axes and frantic energy, Arthur's family was simply waiting it out, their lives quiet and secure in the middle of the frozen wilderness. By the 5th day of the blizzard, Jonas Miller's farm had reached its breaking point. His Hereford cattle were huddled in the southwest corner of his barn, their heads low, their breath freezing into thick crusts of ice on their noses. Jonas had lost 2 heifers that morning, their bodies cold and stiff in the close to mane. Straw. The water troughs were frozen solid again, and his arms were too tired to swing the iron bar any longer. His woodpile was gone. He had burned his last dry log the night before, and now his kitchen stove was cold. He had been forced to burn his dining bench, then 2 wooden chairs, just to keep the room warm enough for his son to sleep. He knew he had to reach Arthur's place, even if it meant walking through a freezing whiteout where he could barely see his own hands. Sarah begged him not to go, fearing he would freeze in the drifts. But Jonas knew that if they stayed, they would all freeze. He pulled his damp coat over his shoulders and stepped out into the white fury of the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, knocking him to his knees. The air was a blinding sheet of horizontal white, with the temperature holding at 25 below zero. Jonas struggled to his feet, orienting himself by the shape of the trees along the fence line, and began his long, dangerous crawl through the drifts toward the foothills. It was a journey of simple survival. Every step was a battle against the wind, his boots sinking thigh-deep into the packed snow, his breath catching in his chest as the freezing air burned his lungs. He fell twice, his hands losing their grip on his walking stick, his body screaming for him to lie down and rest in the soft, white drift. But he thought of his son's cold room, of his wife's pale face, and he kept moving, one slow, agonizing step at a time. When Jonas finally reached Arthur's clearing, the Quonset train was invisible, completely buried under a massive 14-foot snowdrift on the windward side. Only the thin trail of vapor from the chimney pipe indicated that life still existed beneath the white mound. He stumbled toward the southeast door, collapsing against the wood. Arthur Thorne opened the door within seconds. He had heard the dull thud against the wood, and when he saw Jonas lying in the drift, he reached down, grabbed the young rancher by his coat collar, and hauled him inside, pulling the heavy door closed against the screaming wind. Arthur dragged Jonas Miller through the airlock entry and into the first chamber of the Quonset. The transition was so sudden that Jonas's mind struggled to accept it. One moment he was dying in a blind, freezing white hell at 25 below zero. The next, he was lying on a warm concrete floor, surrounded by an air temperature that felt like a mild spring afternoon. Arthur called out to Margaret, asking her to bring dry blankets and a hot drink while he began pulling off Jonas's frozen mittens. Jonas lay on his back, his body shaking with violent tremors as the circulation began to return to his limbs. He looked up at the curved steel ceiling overhead, his eyes blinking in the soft light of the oil lamp. The thermometer on the 7 bulkhead wall read 62 degrees. He accepted the hot mug of pine needle tea from Margaret, the warmth spreading through his chest, and asked Arthur how the space could possibly stay so warm. Arthur helped him up, inviting him to walk through the bulkhead door and see for himself. Jonas stepped into Unit 2 and stopped, his mouth slightly open in astonishment. The middle 35-foot section was completely dry and comfortable, holding a stable temperature of 52 degrees. In the center, Arthur's small flock of laying hens were scratching in the thick straw bedding, their feathers smooth and dry. 2 pregnant sows lay in the corner, sleeping peacefully, their breathing regular and quiet. There was no dampness, no odor of ammonia, no ice on the floorboards. The sheep stood nearby, their wool dry, clean, completely unaffected by the blizzard that was currently destroying Jonas's herd just 2 miles away. Jonas walked to the wooden bulkhead wall and touched the stone lining Arthur had stacked along the bottom. It was warm, radiating a gentle, constant heat that kept the animals comfortable without a single fire in their room. He looked at the animals, then down at his own numb fingers, and felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. He had spent days fighting the winter with everything he had, watching his livestock die, watching his family freeze, believing that there was no way to beat the cold. But here, inside this metal caterpillar, Arthur Thorne had created a place where the winter didn't matter. It was a revelation, a simple, beautiful proof that there was a smarter way to survive. On the afternoon of January 12th, the storm finally began to break. The wind dropped to 15 miles per hour, and the driving snow turned to a light, powdery drift. Arthur and Jonas were outside, digging out the southeast entrance of the Quonset, when they heard the low, chugging sound of a tractor struggling up the valley road. It was Gideon Cole. The proud carpenter sat on his open cab, John Deere, his face red and wind-burned, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He drove the tractor into Arthur's clearing and stopped, looking at the massive snowdrift that completely covered the northern half of the Quonset train. He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff, his boots sinking into the snow, and walked toward the entrance. Gideon stopped in front of them, his jaw tight. He admitted he had lost 5 head of cattle. His water lines were frozen, and his family had been huddled in the kitchen for 3 days. He confessed he had ridden over fearing Jonas had frozen in the drifts. Arthur invited him inside, letting him feel the warmth of the space. Gideon Cole stepped through the airlock door and stopped. The warmth of Unit 1 hit him like a physical thing, and for a moment, the experienced builder looked completely lost. He looked at the cast-iron stove, offset to the west, burning cottonwood, with a steady, quiet hum. He looked at the thermometer on the tear fend. Bulkhead, 63 degrees. He walked to the first bulkhead wall and touched the wood. He knelt down and placed his bare hand on the concrete pad. It was warm, holding the stored thermal energy of the concrete battery. He stood up, walked into Unit 2, and saw Jonas Miller's surviving heifers standing calmly in the straw beside Arthur's sheep, their coats dry, their breathing normal. Jonas stood near the sheep, pointing out that the temperature held at 52 degrees, without any active heaters in the room. Gideon Cole stood in the middle of the warm chamber, his hand resting on the curved steel rib of the Quonset. The man who had spent 30 years building traditional cabins, who had mocked Arthur's iron caterpillar as a tin coffin, looked around the space with a quiet, solemn focus. He admitted his log barn had failed despite costing $12,000, and confessed he had been wrong to dismiss Arthur's work. Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder, telling him there was no need for apologies, and suggested they work together to bring Gideon's remaining cattle into the safety of the dome. The blizzard of January 1955 ended, but the lesson of Arthur Thorne's connected arches remained ingrained in the memory of the valley. The ranchers who had laughed at the iron caterpillar spent the spring months re-examining their own building practices, realizing that the old ways of fighting the cold with brute force and massive wood piles were no longer enough when a smarter, more efficient path was available. By the spring of 1955, the ice on Black Mountain had melted, but the lesson of the 3 Quonsets remained. Gideon Cole began incorporating thermal mass, offsets, and continuous air loop valves into every barn he framed, openly acknowledging the quiet shipwright who had saved his neighbors' herds. The community's skepticism dissolved into deep, lasting respect, and the rust-streaked train cars became a valley landmark. Arthur Thorne continued to live in his connected arches for another decade, never seeking fame or patents, content with the gentle warmth that moved silently through his steel home. Jonas Miller's ranch recovered completely, his cattle thriving in the years that followed, thanks to the winter shelter they found under the iron caterpillar. The simple physics Arthur had brought from the fate Navy had turned winter from a siege into a season. The 3 bolted arches stood as a quiet monument on the plains, proof that the shape of a space can triumph over the cold, and that the greatest warmth is found when pride yields to the simple, saving truth of common sense.